for today. Colin Khoury is the Senior Director of Science and Conservation at the San Diego Botanic Garden, where he works to conserve plants and educate people about the wonders of botany. Colin's research focuses specifically on crop diversity, food security, and plant genetic resources. And today he'll discuss distributions, conservation assessments, and conservation action for crop wild relatives. Colin.
Right. Good afternoon. You hear me okay? Great. All right, so it's my pleasure and honor to get to tell a few stories with you today about these often scraggly, generally forgotten and neglected plants, which I'm deeply in love with. They live in all kinds of interesting places in this nation and beyond, including in pretty extreme environments like the Great Sand Dunes in Colorado that you see here. In what must surely be one of the greatest set of innovations in human history, somehow these sort of plants have transformed into the foods that we eat every day, like that sunflower that has become this giant head there, or this wild carrot that has become these much more edible, differently colored carrots you see here. All right, so what are these things? Right. So a very simple definition is the one that I prefer around what we're going to talk about today, which are the wild relatives of crops, or crop wild relatives. And they're simply wild plants related to domesticated crops or cultivated crops. If you prefer, they're the wild ancestors and the cousins of the foods that we cultivate and eat. There is a more clear boundary or definition around these plants, typically, although there's a lot of argumentation around exactly where it begins and ends. But 50 years ago or so, Harlan and DeWitt came up with this idea of rings of an onion, if you will, in which the crop is in the very middle, and the same biological species, which is typically the progenitor species, is also in that very center there that you'll see as the biological species. That's the crop and its progenitor, wild progenitor. And then around it are a series of rings of related species as they head out into less and less related. And that 50 years ago was developed mainly based on whether you could reproduce the species together, whether you could cross them together. And that has evolved through phylogenetics and many other pieces of scientific evidence to form a much more nuanced understanding now of who's related to who. And still, essentially, this big circle ends up mostly being defined to the genus if you're a botanist in this case. And so for the sunflowers there, mostly the whole Helianthus genus is considered the wild relatives of the sunflower crop. In some of the other crops like wheat, though, there's so much interesting history of mixing and matching of genera or species in that case that it's actually a wider gene pool beyond just the genus of Triticum. All right, so some semantics there. So we have landed on this term called crop wild relatives. You may have noticed, or you may have some cognitive dissonance around that. I do, because the term is grammatically nonsensical. You have the adjective in the middle of the term, as far as I can understand. There's a hot debate about this. And so I'm hoping that the intelligence in this crowd can get us through it. And so you may see in the media or people saying wild crop relatives, which is grammatically correct, but even more nonsensical, because by definition, a crop is not wild. And so wild crop relative doesn't make a lot of sense either. And so the only resolution, I think, is wild relatives of crops. And so if you will follow me in this, maybe we can get with one more letter in our acronym to something that makes sense. I wanted to mention, so a previous speaker brought up a really important point that, or both in some sense, brought up this point that it's amazing how little we know actually still about biodiversity. And it's crazy to me that that is also true even with our crops and their wild relatives. And if you stop and think for just a minute about other beings on this planet, and you think about our deepest relationships with them, you might think about our pets, for instance, other species that we're deeply connected to. I would argue that our crops, like in livestock, are also deep, deep connections that we have, some of the deepest. And so how is it that we also still don't know like some pretty important things about them, like their history? And so we don't even know, for instance, really clearly where some crops really originated or come from, and even more or less do we know about their wild relatives. But there is some attempts to really bring together the information around the world and make that accessible. And so the link that I put at the bottom of this, and I hope that all of these slideshows are available to the folks who are here and beyond. I believe they will be, because I provide a lot of links that I hope will be interesting to you. This effort, which is by the USDA, and a colleague who runs this effort, who's in the crowd here, Dr. Melanie Khoury, is a massive global effort to actually put together who all the crops are in the world and who all the wild relatives of those crops are. And so anyone can get on there and look up sunflowers and understand who all the relatives are and where they come from and what they've been used for, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And so there's the place to go. All right, so I said often neglected, but actually in the last 10 years or so, somehow these things have gotten all over in the news. If, like me, you're following the news looking for wild plants related to crops and how interesting they are. And so I really believe like somehow they've captured the media attention, and you'll see a lot about these wild relatives of crops. That's not just true of the media. They also, direct terminology has become embedded in our highest level international agreements around not only biodiversity, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity's Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the newest, just recently adopted framework for the next 10 years and beyond, but also the previous 10 years, but also our agreements around sustainable development. And so the top one there is the Sustainable Development Goals, and in the goal 2.5, it directly says we got to do something about these wild relatives of crops, wild species. And so really like they in the last decade, 2 decades, these scraggly wild plants have become pretty clearly important on international political levels, in the media. And so what is all the fuss about these things? Why are we interested in them? There's a couple of reviews of their uses in modern agriculture. And it turns out that these wild progenitors that are so historically interesting in the innovations of humans are also really significant to modern humanity, to modern eating. And so there's a couple of reviews that really try to get into this. And this is just the number of published publications that are talking about using these wild plants in plant breeding to bring in traits of interest into modern crops. And this is actually a vast underestimate of the number of publications, or the number of uses, because this is just publications, which is really the academic world, or those who want to publish. The private sector, for instance, uses these wild relatives a lot to breed into their varieties, and they don't particularly publish about it. So it's going up. What are they being used for? Many uses. And primarily that is biotic stresses, that is pest and disease resistance, increasing resistance to bugs in modern crops. Also a lot around cold and heat tolerance, salinity tolerance, abiotic stresses, and many other traits. And so we now arrive in the year we are, with essentially every modern crop having activity of wild relatives, wild genes being brought into all of our modern crops. You'd be tempted to think that we'd be also bringing in all of this scraggly little wild stuff, taking us backwards, if you will. And that is true. It is difficult to breed with these scraggly wild plants, and you need to take out the stuff you don't want and keep the stuff you do. But there's also a lot of surprises within these plants, that is, surprises within their genetics. And so in a seminal paper from 20 years ago, 25 years ago now, Tengse Mikut showed, among other things, that are documented, that you can take small green tomatoes. And in the B there, the crop variety they bred with is in the left side of B. On the right side is a deeper red that was created by bringing in traits from that small green tomato. And on the bottom, a similar story of a very small red tomato bred with those medium-sized Roma-like tomatoes making an even bigger tomato. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff that you don't particularly see at the phenotypic level that if you start to bring in those traits, add value to modern agriculture. All right, so don't judge a book by its cover. The international world started to really generate some monies and some funding around these wild plants in 2010 or so through a project that was funded generously by the government of Norway and some other donors. That was one of the largest agricultural research projects at the international level of its time, about $50 million. That was to really try to understand who these wild relatives are around the world and how well they're conserve them in seed banks, in agricultural research seed banks, and also in botanic gardens, and then start to breed with them to make our agriculture more resilient to climate change. I was part of that research and I'm very glad to be part and did my PhD through that. And what my part was where are these species and how well conserved are they? And so I'm going to walk you very quickly through the essential methodology. And I want to do so, among other reasons, because it's a thank you note, a love letter to institutions like this. And so as a geographer, what we did first was try to understand where the species live. And how we do that is we come to herbaria like are in this building, or even better, if they have digitized everything they have, then we just get online and we find the points, the occurrences where they have been seen in the wild for species like this wild grape, Vitis monticola, that occurs in Texas. And so all those gray points are essentially what's known about the native range of the species. We not only went to the herbaria, but also to the botanic gardens and the agricultural seed banks who have living specimens, either in their gardens or in their seed banks, the seeds themselves, and also mapped where they had been collected in the past. And so the single purple there you see is the one time that this species has been collected and has been brought into what we call an ex situ conservation system as a living plant. And so then we perform what we call the gap analysis, which is essentially what is the distribution of that species out there, and then how well have we collected it. And so the green is our estimate of where the species may occur, or hopefully, and then we might draw, for instance, a buffer around the single point where people have gone in the past and collected and say, okay, we've collected there. We don't need to go back to the purple, but everything else there is still where we might need to go in a geographic sense to collect what hasn't been collected. And some numbers on that, approximately 12.5% of the distribution we considered collected. And so we have quite a bit more to go. And then some other texture, like looking at the habitats or ecoregions that the species lives in. And by some spatial layers, this species lives in 3 ecoregions. And one is actually right in that purple area there. And then there's the green, and then there's the red, which is another type of region in southern Texas. And it lets us know that actually this species has been collected from or overlapping with 2 of the ecoregions, but one is left, that red one that hasn't been collected from. So a little bit of an environmental or ecological texturing to where we might go to collect possibly novel genes for the species. All right, so that was the kind of efforts that went into looking at eventually about the top 100 crops in the world, starting crop by crop. And so some of our first papers were around crops like the beans, the phaseolus, that's our pinto beans and our lima beans and scarlet runner beans. And this is a picture of essentially the distribution of the 80 or 100 species of beans, with the hotspot of diversity in Mesoamerica and central Mexico. And then also revealing through that gap analysis where we really haven't collected and have those seeds or that germplasm for our crop breeding in the future, which also, and this is that smaller figure on the right, shows us that actually central Mexico is the spot to go to collect more. And that was also turned into a mega-analysis published now about 10 years ago that looked across 100 crops, over 1,000 of our wild relatives that are the closest relatives to our 100 most important crops. And you can find all these papers open access online. And then a final step that we did was take these sort of analyses and asked if we could help the international community, nations and others, answer the question as to how well they're doing in conserving these species, since we have come up with legally binding agreements that we should be actually taking care of them better. And so these are indicators that we can know, for instance, in the United States, how many of these species are fairly well conserved in our seed banks or botanic gardens in the wild, and how far along we need to go before we consider ourselves done with the job, which of course we're never done with the job, but we could head in the direction of being done with the job. All right, so I'm going to take a break now and talk more about the United States and what we know about what we have here. So the first step, understanding the conservation status of such species, is to have an inventory. What are the species in a country? And so that inventory ended up being massive, actually about 5,000 species in total, which is maybe a quarter or a little less of the flora, less now of the flora, but quite a bit of the flora of the United States. And if you whittle that down, you get down to maybe 3,000 or even 2,000 that are native, quite interesting wild relatives. If you whittle that down even further to the closest relatives of really important crops around the world, particularly food crops, you get that pie chart. And so the United States has this incredible richness of sunflower wild relatives, of blackberries and blueberries, of grapes, peaches and pecans and plums and gooseberries and several other crops. A lot of efforts over the last decade or two to document and try to understand better about what is this richness of native plants we have here that are related to crops, including in a series of books. And what we come away with is a sense that even though we aren't in a region of the world that's typically recognized as one of the great mega centers of innovation of major crops around the world, where a lot of them were domesticated, we are in a place where quite a bit of that actually happened still, and where we have a deep richness of these wild cousins, wild relatives. And so this is 4 examples of very important uses of native crop wild relatives that are actively used in plant breeding today. So far, I've provided fairly simple examples of how this works. Like you just bring a trait from a wild plant and you pop it in and suddenly it's more cold tolerant or something like that. It's actually complicated science, and it's a very textured, beautiful, fascinating story. This is a slide taken actually from a previous speaker in this series, Dr. Allison Miller, who's a great researcher, and a shout out to Dr. Jun Win, who's also here at the Smithsonian, who's done a lot of the taxonomy in this group. And so grapes, this is a grape, and what it shows there is both the rootstock on the bottom, the graft stalk, and then the scion, as it's called, which is the top, which is the part that's produces the fruit that are eaten. And what modern grape viticulture actually looks like is a tremendous contribution and mixing and matching from wild relatives. And so on the bottom, if I can start there, what's actually on the bottom of the grapes that we eat as table grapes or we drink as wine is typically a wild plant, and typically a wild native plant from North America, one of these 3 species that's shown there. On the top, although the world mainly still drinks or eats this one single species, Vitis vinifera, it's actually becoming more interesting and more complicated over time too, like this variety that's shown there that is actually, well, nobody really knows exactly what's in it still, but easily 6 or 7 different wild species mixed and matched coming in with vinifera to form this fruit that is a grape that's also available. And so actually what you're drinking is not just this sort of European crop that we think of now, but all of these traits that are in from wild relatives on the bottom, on the top, making this modern variety or modern crop happen. The other side of the story, unfortunately, and you've heard this from the previous 2 speakers, is that as wild plants, they're often also threatened. And so this is 4 examples of interesting crop wild relatives. Sorry, I just said it, wild relatives of crops that that are either federally listed endangered or threatened. And so there's a lot of work to be done to conserve these species, both in their natural habitats and in the seed banks and botanic gardens. We've been now really working on trying to map out these species, where they live and in the United States. And so we focused on the most, what we considered the most important 600 as a start, and that is native relatives of important food crops from food crops around the world, but they're native plants to the United States. And what you get is a map like this. If you map the distributions all together, if you have yellow or red, it means that a wild relative lives there, which means that no matter where you are in this country, there's a wild relative lurking, behind you, or in the crack of the concrete, or in your backyard, which is a wonderful thing. And so how are we doing on the conservation of those species? So this is a diagram where every one of these dots is the conservation status of these 600 wild relatives that are our native natural resource. And we categorize them on a scale from 0 to 100, where if you're at 0, we really haven't done any conservation at all. And if you're at 100, we're doing great. And then they're bucketed into 4 categories there. That's kind of a traffic light. You can see the red, which is urgent priority for further conservation action based on how they're doing. In the middle, there's high priority in the orange, lower or medium priority, in the yellow, and then low priority for further conservation action in the green. And so we can see in the middle there that in terms of collecting them and putting them into our botanic gardens and seed banks, we've got a lot of work to do. We can see that in terms of protecting them in our open spaces in the United States, we're doing a little better, but there's still a long way to go. And if you average those scores together at the top, you can see that we've got some work to do still. Just to put a little more tangibility to that, these are the same species. They're just bucketed into the types of crops that they are on the left side there, whether they're related to a nut crop or an oil crop or a cereal. And then on the right, the exact crop that they're related to. And so the take-home message, unfortunately, is what we know already, which is that these plants have some needs in terms of conservation, and we've got a lot of work to do. Which brings me to the rest of the presentation, which is a series of talking about interesting efforts that are happening now to conserve these species and make them better known. The first starts with outreach around these results. And so we've been making efforts to not only just publish papers, but really make the results accessible out there. And so there's a really nice website where you can delve into who these species are and dip down into what kind of ecological regions they live in, and whether they're in park systems or forest service areas or whatever. And those are those 2 pictures on the right. And then using citizen science programs such as iNaturalist, which is just such a fabulous tool that is becoming so common. And so this is an iNaturalist project focused on these wild relatives of the United States. And just by trying to understand who out there has marked, just walking around, where a wild relative is in the categories that we've defined it, we have over 2 million records here in the US. And this right picture here, which unfortunately the background was green and then the points are green, but if you see a green point there, this is the DC area here, and these are our occurrences of wild relatives. So once again, they're all around you, lurking right behind you. We've been working on some really fun ways to do outreach that celebrates these wild plants and also brings in chefs and other fun people to work with. And so we did one in Tucson some years ago. That's a really interesting region of the country right on the border that has a tremendous amount of wild relatives that are relatives of crops that come more from south of there, like relatives of squash and chili peppers and several other crops like that. And so that is a really neat place to celebrate those wild relatives. And in fact, we also have in that region a really important preserve, which is a Forest Service area, a special research area dedicated to the preservation of our wild chili pepper. And so that was a wonderful step that was taken about 20 years ago by the Forest Service to start to look at these plants and how we can preserve them. About 10 years ago now, I guess, 8 years ago, there was a really neat collaboration that was funded by the USDA and also the US Botanic Garden to bring together botanic gardens and agricultural researchers around topics like crop wild relatives and raise public awareness, but also see how can we work better together as institutions that have been typically in, for instance, different buildings over here and over there on the other side of the mall. And can we work better together? And we came up with eventually 5 tenets that we thought were really important to work together on. One was more science. As mentioned, we really still need to know who these species are and where they live and how their conservation is doing. And then we need to protect them in their natural habitats around the country, around North America in this case. We need to collect and preserve them in botanic gardens and in our seed banks. We need to do that breeding work to make them usable in agriculture, and we need to raise public awareness. We published that for agricultural researchers and also for garden folks and for the land managers in different journals to really try to get the message out. And for the last 5 or 10 years, we've really been working on this. And so some of the exciting efforts that have been happening, this is a new, over the last couple of years, Forest Service effort that has been looking at the wild cranberries that are also rich or interesting in this country across Forest Service lands. And that's a collaboration between Forest Service and the USDA's Ag Research Service and some academics that identifies genetically interesting populations on Forest Service lands that could be designated, like those chili peppers, as a preserve or really take extra special care of these special cranberry bogs. And you can see that they come from very different environments. And so that is a proxy for the genetic diversity that's also being found to be quite different in different places. Another argument for why we should work together, in this case, agricultural research seed banks like the USDA's and the Botanic Gardens, is depicted on this picture. This is the distribution of those wild relatives in the background, and then this is the home of our agricultural research centers as the USDA's seed banks around the country. And that's a pretty good coverage. But then if you map all the botanic gardens on top of that, you can kind of see that the botanic gardens are in a lot more places. And if we work together, perhaps we can do a better job of doing the taxonomic research, the field stuff, the conservation work, the breeding, the public education, everything that could be done to raise the profile of these species. And so one of the ways that we're doing this as a way of wrapping up is a fun group with a difficult acronym. This is our North American Fruit and Nut Tree Crop Wild Relative Working Group that we call the NAFANT. And it's a great group of people who are fruity and nutty and like these wild species and want to work on them together. My garden, our garden, San Diego, has been participating in this as a facilitator, but also has benefited from being able to be part of these partnerships that have been developed with funding by the US Botanic Garden and being rolled out by the Botanic Garden Conservation International, which Abby Meyer will be speaking soon here. And that has enabled us to look at some of these really rare relatives occurring in California in this case, like these 3 that you see here, and conserve them, bring them into our botanic gardens, and also bring them into the USDA's germplasm system and other botanic gardens. And so that has been a wonderful effort that's rolled out $40,000 or $50,000 already to do conservation action on our native resources here. So finally, if I managed to have interested you in these wild relatives of crops, we have a big symposium coming up in Denver Botanical Garden in September that we would love for you to show up if you're interested. And a link is there. If you just Google Crop Wild Relatives 2024 Denver Botanic Garden or something like that, you'll get there. And so I've added a few quite a few. I'm an academic-y person, so quite a few links there if you want to follow them, and a bunch of papers that you can get online. And thanks for your interest.
Quick question, if there is one.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the flavor profile of some of these crops. And then in addition to conservation and botanical gardens, have you looked at property owners who are doing restoration projects or like permaculture nurseries or things like that?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. That you started with flavor profiles, if that has been researched?
Flavor profiles. If you could just, you showed cooking, like a cookbook or something that people were using for it. I was
right.
wondering if you could talk about your own experience with the flavor profile
Oh,
of
great.
some of the wild crops. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, okay, so there's definitely more diversity in the wild relatives and typically in most crops than there is in the crop. And we have this idea of a domestication bottleneck, which when we domesticated these plants, we only took some populations of the wild species. And so we only took part of it. And so absolutely, there's a wider amount of interesting flavors, some nice and some not so nice that are out there to explore. And so, yeah, I've experimented myself to the chagrin of my family and others in some cases, but we're finding the ones we like.
And then are you trying to get people to grow these on their land at all as another method of preserving them?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So these plants are interesting. Some of them are really rare endemic type plants like have been talked about by the previous two speakers. Some of them are more weedy and can really grow anywhere. And a lot of them are in between. And so there's all kinds of opportunities to preserve them, not only in so-called really natural habitats, but even if you're a farmer on farm in a hedgerow, for instance. And so there's actually some folks in the crowd here too that have farms that are actively looking at preserving these species, among other things like pollinators as a way that they can contribute to this conservation. Thank you.
Regarding the iNaturalist data that you had, was that a special initiative to go look for the wild relatives, or would you just mine the data that was there, or some other combination?
Thank you. I hope that iNaturalist is starting to become well known. It's such an incredible initiative, and part of the reason that it's incredible is that you actually don't need to have a big major project. You can really just garner what's already people just going and doing their thing and finding whatever they like. So this project didn't require actually any outreach to anybody. It's simply drawing the lines around what are wild relatives and finding out what people have already been just recognizing out there based on their own interests. And so 2 million observations of people that just happen to see a wild relative. We also do have a series of iNaturalist projects that are more concerted about getting citizen scientists involved in this. But this core one is so neat because anyone, whatever your interest is out there, you can form an iNaturalist project and scoop that information and see what's out there around the world.